Inside a windswept seaside villa, Evelyn stood in disbelief as her former son-in-law and 15 strangers barged in, claiming her bedroom and treating her like their own servant. Will the horrifying truth of $300,000 stolen be enough to help her find the justice she seeks? I'm Casey. In Florida, Evelyn Clark is learning to say goodbye to the past to protect her peace. Where's the line between kindness and quiet endurance when family hurts us most? Her journey reminds us to value our self-respect and time in our later years. Let's listen to Evelyn's story in her own words. I still remember with vivid clarity the exact sensation of stepping into this villa in Naples for the very first time. The rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the back porch felt like a soft melody designed to soothe the long, weary years I spent hunched over blueprints in the laboratory, and the dull, persistent ache that has resided in my chest ever since Emily left me. At this stage of my life, I no longer go searching for the grand or the spectacular. A small, quiet corner where I can brew a hot cup of Earl Grey tea and watch the orange hues of the sunset is more than enough for my soul. Yet even in this newfound stillness, I still find the shadows of my past lurking in every drawer and every old photograph I have been so meticulously rearranging this afternoon. My entire life was defined by cold numbers, technical drawings, and the intricate systems of a mechanical engineering firm in Detroit. Being an engineer taught me that everything in this world must have an order, and every complex problem has a solution if you only look closely enough at the raw data. I naturally brought that professional habit into my everyday existence. The old suitcase I just pulled from the closet is filled with folders clipped together in perfect sequence, ranging from mundane utility bills to bank statements dating back more than 10 years. My late husband used to tease me by calling me a mechanical old lady, but that was simply my way of maintaining control over a world that seemed to be slowly slipping through my fingers. My gaze finally stopped at the picture of Emily sitting on the white mantelpiece. She had a sun-drenched smile that looked exactly like her father. It has been 6 long years since that sudden illness took her away, leaving a hollow void in my heart that no million-dollar villa could ever hope to fill. When Emily passed, Brian, her husband, became the only remaining thread that made me feel like I still had a family left in this world. I loved him, and I helped him financially without a single second thought, as if my support were a way to make up for the daughter I lost. I truly believed that my generosity would be met with a sliver of sincerity to comfort me in these final years of my journey. But it turns out that time does not just bring maturity, it also strips away the layers of pretense and reveals the harsh truths I had been intentionally ignoring for far too long. This afternoon, the sea breeze blew harder against the windows than usual, and the sudden sharp ring of the phone cut through my memories, signaling a storm I never saw coming. The shrill ring of the phone sliced through the thick salt air of the Naples afternoon. I looked down at the screen and saw the name Brian. That name used to bring me the warmth of a son, but now it only makes my heart tighten with a sharp, familiar pain. Before I picked up, I found myself staring at the small expense ledger sitting next to my cold tea. It was a silent witness to 2,190 days I spent living in a lie. For 6 years since Emily passed, I turned myself into an interest-free bank for the man who once called me Mom. I remember that autumn so clearly, right after the funeral. Brian came to me with eyes red from crying, saying he could not survive in a house filled with so many memories without my help. My heart softened instantly. I signed that first check for $50,000 to pay off his MBA debt, telling myself it was a way to care for the future my daughter had always wanted for him. I used the language of numbers to mask the depth of my grief. He was so skilled at weaving Emily into every request for money, saying she would want us to be stable, or that she would hate to see him struggling like this. I was a grieving widow, terrified of being alone, and I walked into his trap with my eyes wide open. I turned the pages of my ledger one by one. In the second year, it was $30,000 for a new car because the old one held too much sorrow. By the third and fourth years, I had sent over $100,000 more to save his imaginary business ventures. The total was nearly $300,000. This was the money my husband and I had spent our entire lives saving through hard work and engineering grit. I had wasted more than just money. I had wasted 6 years that should have been spent healing or traveling or finally living for myself. Instead, I spent that time feeding a parasite that wore the mask of family. Every check I signed felt like cutting away a piece of my own self-respect just to get a hollow phone call on the holidays. Sitting here now in this $2 million villa, which is the last asset I refuse to let go, I finally see the naked truth. Ryan never loved me. He loved the digits in my bank account. My biggest regret is not the lost money, but that I allowed him to use Emily as a cruel tool to control me for all these years. The phone continued to ring, persistent and clinging, just like he has been for the last decade. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold clarity of numbers finally taking over my mind. It was time for this system to be completely reset. I pressed the button to answer, and the voice on the other end was no longer pretending to be sad. It was a bold and arrogant command. "Mom, I am coming over, and I am not alone." After I pressed the end button on the call from Brian, the silence in my living room felt unusually heavy, yet strangely calm. His parting words about not coming alone still echoed in the corners of the room like a hidden declaration against the peace I had worked so hard to find. But for the first time in years, I did not feel my heart racing with that familiar dread. There is a point where a person reaches the very bottom of their disappointment, and what they find there is not more tears, but a clarity so cold it feels like steel. I set the phone down on the mahogany table and looked out at the ocean as it began to turn a deep shade of purple under the Florida sunset. It was time to stop playing the role of the grieving widow and return to the woman I actually am, an engineer who knows exactly how to troubleshoot a failing system. I brewed myself a cup of black coffee with no sugar. The sharp bitterness was exactly what I needed to stay focused. For 6 years, I had allowed my emotions to take the wheel, letting the grief of losing Emily cloud my better judgment. I had paid for Brian's presence with checks totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, only to be repaid with elaborate lies and emotional manipulation. But today, the mention of 15 people was the final straw. He seemed to think my home was a free resort, and that I was his unpaid staff. No, Brian. This system has been malfunctioning for far too long, and I am the only one who can hit the reset button. A strange sense of relief began to spread through my chest as I made a silent vow to myself. This would be the absolute last time I allowed him to trespass into my life. I stood up and walked into my study, where I opened my laptop. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a speed and precision I thought I had lost years ago. The first step for any engineer facing a structural risk is to establish a solid perimeter of defense. I logged into my Ring security system, checking every single camera angle, from the heavy front gate to the secluded back porch, to ensure that every motion sensor was active and every lens was crystal clear. Then, I opened my personal financial archives. I began to categorize every single transaction and wire transfer linked to Brian over the last 6 years into a detailed spreadsheet. I watched as the columns grew longer and the totals climbed higher. Each number and each date was highlighted in a sharp red. These were no longer just fragments of a painful past. They were data points in a larger pattern of exploitation. I called the local neighborhood security service to alert them of a potential disturbance by a large, unauthorized group. I spoke with a calm authority that I hadn't used since I managed projects in Detroit. By the time I closed my laptop, I no longer felt like a lonely or vulnerable woman. I was Evelyn Clark, and I was finally taking back the keys to my own life. What do you think of Evelyn's decision? Have you ever felt forced to buy a loved one's affection through quiet endurance? Share your reflections below. I'm Casey, and I'm here to listen. I want to know how you found the strength to overcome these trials. Your wisdom inspires us all. Let's support one another. After I put the phone down, I did not simply sit there waiting in the shadows of this windswept seaside villa. As an engineer who spent decades in laboratories and mechanical plants back in Detroit, I have always understood that information is the most powerful tool a person can hold, especially when facing an unexpected malfunction in life. While I waited for the sound of engines on the gravel driveway, I opened my iPad. I needed to perform one final system sweep to truly understand who this man was, the one about to step into my sanctuary. For 6 years, I had believed Brian's words, his promises, and those quiet tears he shed whenever he visited or called to ask for help. But today, I decided to trust only the data. I took a deep breath, feeling the salt air of the Florida coast fill my lungs, and I began searching for the truth behind the name Brian Miller, using the same precision I once used to design complex machinery. I logged into Instagram, a place I rarely visited, because it always seemed too shallow compared to the real world of gears and numbers. But there it was, an account titled Brian M. Life. It was so vibrant and so alien that it felt like a physical blow to my chest. In those photos, Brian looked nothing like the grieving widower he played whenever he sat at my kitchen table. He was standing next to bright red sports cars, wearing designer clothes from head to toe, and holding expensive wine at rooftop bars in Miami, where the city lights seemed to hide every ugly truth. I saw a young woman with a sharp smile and a calculating look in her eyes, appearing in almost every post. Her name was Jessica. They were laughing in a post from just 2 days ago, with a caption that made my stomach turn. It said, "Heading to Naples for a 3-week beach party at her private villa." It ended with a tag that said, "Thank you to our anonymous sponsor." That phrase, anonymous sponsor, felt like a slap in the face. It made every bit of my patience crumble like a poorly built foundation. I looked back at the bank statements I had just pulled up on my screen. Those $5,000 and $10,000 transfers, which I thought were for his student loans or for repairing Emily's old house, had actually been burned on these luxury trips and late-night parties. In the middle of 2024, with inflation pushing the cost of living higher than ever, it is a struggle for many retirees to even cover their health insurance or their rising electric bills. Yet here I was, looking at proof that Brian had used my hard-earned savings, the blood and sweat of my husband and myself, to buy a fake life of glamour for him and his new wife. The regret of being too generous made my chest tighten. But it also sparked a cold hardness within me, a resolve to protect what was left of my life. Right then, the sound of reality cut through my bitter thoughts. It was the sound of heavy tires grinding against the gravel. Not just one car, but 3 black Cadillac Escalades pulled up in front of the main entrance with an arrogance that was hard to ignore. My heart skipped a beat at the sight of this blatant invasion, but I kept my hands steady against the table, refusing to let fear take over. Through my Ring security camera, I watched Brian step out of the first vehicle, looking like a man who owned the world. He wore a high-end polo shirt and sunglasses that covered half his face, like a celebrity on vacation. Following him was a crowd of strangers, young men and women in revealing clothes, 15 of them in total. They were shouting and laughing, carrying large coolers of alcohol, suitcases, and surfboards, as if they had just landed at a high-end resort they owned, rather than the home of a woman who had lost her only daughter. I walked to the front door, just as Brian tried to use his old key, the one I had been too careless to take back after Emily's funeral. He stopped for a split second when he saw me standing there, but he quickly regained his shameless attitude. He didn't offer a greeting or ask how I was doing. Instead, he just pointed at the noisy group behind him and told me these were his friends from Miami. He said they were all exhausted from the long drive in the Florida sun, and then he told me to go inside and get the guest rooms ready and prepare some food and drinks for them. That was when Jessica stepped forward. She looked me up and down with a look of pure contempt, as if I were nothing more than a housemaid, while she kept her phone held high, recording everything for her social media followers. She was clearly the new gatekeeper of Brian's life, the one who had helped erase any lingering bit of conscience he might have had toward me. "Hello, Mrs. Clark. I am Jessica," she said, in a tone that was completely hollow. She told me the villa was beautiful and that the ocean view would definitely help her video go viral. Without waiting for a response or a welcome, she simply walked right past me. She intentionally brushed her shoulder against mine, pushing me aside like I was an invisible obstacle in the way of her luxury weekend. That small physical contact was a shock to my system. This was my home, a sanctuary I bought with a lifetime of hard work and sleepless nights over engineering blueprints. As I watched Brian casually ordering his friends to haul their gear into my living room, I realized the gap between us was no longer just about time or family. It was a deep moral canyon that could never be crossed. I stood in the middle of my own house, feeling like a stranger watching a vulgar play of betrayal. And I knew that my journey to reclaim my peace was only just beginning. The loud voices of those strangers filled my main hall, instantly drowning out the soft scent of lavender candles I usually burned to find peace in the afternoons. I stood there frozen as I watched Jessica casually grab her bright pink suitcase and march straight up the oak staircase toward the second floor. Each of her footsteps felt like a hammer blow against my self-respect. I hurried after her, my breath coming in short gasps, not just from the steep stairs, but from a dark sense of dread that was tightening around my chest. By the time I reached the hallway, the double wooden doors leading into my master bedroom were already swung wide open. I stopped dead in my tracks at the threshold. Jessica had already tossed her fake fur coat onto my white silk duvet, the one luxury I had treated myself to after my retirement day. She was standing out on the balcony, spinning around to capture the wide view of the Gulf of Mexico through her phone camera lens. "Oh my God, Brian, the light here is perfect!" she squealed, with a voice that was sharp and full of triumph. She shouted about how a morning routine video in this spot would definitely hit 1 million views. Brian walked in right behind her, casually dropping his heavy duffel bag onto the velvet armchair my late husband had loved so much. He looked at me without a hint of remorse and simply waved his hand as if he were giving orders to a housekeeper. He told me that this room was the largest and Jessica needed the space for her work. He then had the nerve to tell me to move my things to the small guest room at the very end of the hall, saying, after all, I was only one person living alone. My heart physically ached when I saw Jessica reach out and carelessly shove the framed photo of Emily to the side, just to make room for her cluttered makeup kits. The picture was pushed into a dark corner, leaning precariously against the wall, just like my heart was in that moment. That was the final boundary. "Stop, right now!" I heard my own voice come out trembling, but filled with a sudden surge of pure rage. I told them this was my room, and they had no right to be here. But Brian only gave me a cold sneer, the same look that had been deceiving me for 6 long years. He stepped closer, using his height to loom over me, and told me not to overreact. He said family is supposed to share, and then he casually mentioned that his friends were hungry. He told me to check the fridge, to make some snacks, and to get some fresh towels ready because they all needed to rest. He turned his back on me, leaving me standing there in the middle of the wreckage of my privacy. His lack of gratitude and his sense of entitlement were written in every move he made. He did not see me as a mother or even a person. He saw me as a free service station and an old servant who was obligated to provide for his luxury lifestyle. As I watched Jessica spray my expensive perfume on herself, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The fear I felt only moments ago suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold and sharp determination. I realized I could no longer offer kindness to people who had no hearts. I quietly stepped out of the room, my hand gripping my phone tightly. The details of my security system and the specific Florida laws regarding unlawful entry began to click into place in my mind like a perfect engineering blueprint. It was time to show them exactly what an engineer does when her home is under attack from the inside. I closed the master bedroom door behind me, leaving the loud thumping dance music and the overwhelming smell of cheap perfume to stain my private sanctuary. As I walked down the grand oak staircase, I looked down at the swarm of strangers who had made themselves at home. They were popping open cans of White Claw and scattering greasy potato chips across my expensive granite countertops. I felt a cold surge of electricity travel down my spine, but it was not the tremor of fear. It was the activation of a defense system that had been forged over decades in the engineering world. I was no longer just a grieving mother or a widow lost in regret. In that moment, I stepped back into the shoes of Evelyn Clark, the woman who had managed some of the most complex mechanical systems in Detroit. I knew with absolute certainty that every unauthorized intrusion into a functioning system had to be identified and then completely removed. I walked directly to my small study on the ground floor and locked the heavy door from the inside. The first thing I did was open my smart home management app. In my professional world, data is the only absolute truth. I began tricksud the recorded footage from the Ring camera at my front door. I watched the digital playback of Brian using his physical strength to push past me to enter my home. I watched Jessica arrogantly claim my bedroom and the flood of their friends pouring in like a broken dam. I saved every single clip into an encrypted cloud folder. Next, I pulled up my digital property deed and reviewed the specific Florida statutes regarding the castle doctrine. In this state, your home is your sanctuary, and no one has the legal right to force their presence upon you without your explicit consent. I took a deep breath and looked at the list of 15 strangers currently destroying my living room. My system was fully prepared. I stepped out of the study and stood at the landing of the stairs, looking down at the chaos. Brian's friends were dancing and filming TikTok videos in the middle of my home. One young man had the audacity to rest his muddy boots on the antique oak table I had cherished for years. "Everyone, listen to me," I said, my voice sounding dry but sharp like a crack of a whip. The music suddenly died, and 15 pairs of eyes turned toward me with looks of annoyance and surprise. I told them very clearly that I was demanding they leave my property immediately because they were trespassing. I gave them exactly 10 minutes to pack their belongings and get out. A wave of laughter broke out among the group. Jessica walked down from the upstairs landing with a glass of red wine in her hand, looking at me with pure mockery. She asked if I was becoming senile and said that Brian told them this was his house. Brian stepped out from the kitchen, his face flushed a deep red with anger. "He told me not to embarrass him in front of his friends and said I should just go to bed because I was clearly tired." He was trying to use the sheer pressure of the crowd to make me feel small and powerless, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. I did not offer him a single word in response. Instead, I pulled out my phone and pressed the 3 numbers that every person in this country knows the weight of: 911. I turned the volume to the highest setting on the speakerphone. The Naples police dispatcher answered and asked what emergency I was reporting. I spoke with a calm and measured tone and identified myself as Evelyn Clark, the owner of the villa at 1202 Seabreeze. I reported that a group of 17 strangers had unlawfully entered my residence and were refusing to leave despite my orders. I mentioned there were signs of threatened violence and property damage, and that I required immediate intervention. The look on Brian's face shifted from angry red to a pale, sickly white. His friends began to whisper among themselves, and a few of them started quietly gathering their bags. Brian lunged forward as if to grab my phone, but I stepped back behind the kitchen island and gripped a long bread knife from the counter. I did not hold it to attack him, but to clearly mark the physical boundary of my safety. I told him the police were on their way and that his 10 minutes were already counting down. In less than 10 minutes, the blue and red lights of police cruisers were flashing against my front gate. 2 officers entered the house, looking at the messy scene with a high level of caution. Immediately, Brian changed his entire demeanor. His eyes filled with fake tears, and his voice became choked with emotion. He told the officers that thank God they had arrived. He began a calculated performance of gaslighting, telling them that I was his mother-in-law and that I had not been mentally stable since the death of my daughter. He said I had invited them all for the summer, but then suddenly forgot and started having an episode in the middle of the night. He told the officers he was deeply concerned for my mental health. Jessica joined in, pretending to be terrified, and saying that I had even threatened them with a knife. They were trying to paint me as a confused and dangerous old woman, to strip away my legal voice. It was the most disgusting and calculated attack I had ever witnessed in my entire life. I stood in complete silence and allowed them to finish their entire performance. The officers looked at me with doubt in their eyes and asked if I had anything to say for myself. I smiled calmly and handed them my iPad. I told the officers that I had recorded video from my security cameras at 4 o'clock that afternoon, showing exactly how Brian had used force to push his way into the house. I showed them the legal deed to the house, which was in my name alone. Then I showed them the Instagram post Brian had made 2 days ago, bragging about how he was coming to take over my villa without my permission. I told them I was completely lucid and was requesting these people be removed for my own safety. When the video of Brian shoving me appeared on the screen, The atmosphere in the room turned ice cold. The lead officer turned to Brian with a very stern expression. He told Brian that he and his friends needed to leave the premises immediately, or they would all be arrested for trespassing and elder abuse. As I watched Brian and Jessica angrily drag their suitcases out to the cars under the watchful eyes of the police, I felt a sense of safety slowly returning to the house. It felt like a system that had finally been patched and secured. Brian turned back to look at me one last time, with eyes full of pure hatred. He screamed that I would regret this, and that I would end up dying all alone in this castle of mine. He slammed the car door shut, and the engines roared as they sped away. I stood alone in the quiet of my living room and felt my breathing finally return to a normal rhythm. I knew this was only a small victory in a much larger struggle. Brian would not stop, especially since he was still hiding the truth about the $300,000 he had taken from me. But tonight, for the first time in 6 long years, I knew I would sleep peacefully in my own room, with Emily's photograph placed back in its rightful spot on the mantel. After the heavy front door finally clicked shut and the last of the police sirens faded into the distance, the silence that returned to my villa was not the peaceful sanctuary I had been longing for. Instead, it was a hollow and haunting quiet that seemed to weigh down on my shoulders like a leaden cloak. I stood alone in the middle of my living room, staring at the wreckage of the evening. There were scuff marks on the polished wood floors, crumbs scattered across the granite, and the lingering artificial scent of the perfumes those strangers had sprayed in my halls. I had thought that getting them out of my house would be the end of it, but I was far too naive to understand the depths of cruelty that a person can reach when they are cornered and exposed. The silence was suddenly shattered by the persistent vibration of my phone on the kitchen island, a frantic series of pings and notifications that signaled a new kind of struggle was beginning in a place where walls and locks could not protect me. The internet. I picked up the phone with trembling fingers and opened the local community page for our Naples neighborhood. There, right at the very top, was a post from Brian that had already gathered hundreds of reactions and shares. He had taken a candid photo of me earlier in the evening while I was holding that bread knife to keep him back. Under the harsh glare of the flash, my face looked distorted and angry, and my hair was disheveled. Brian had written a long, heart-wrenching caption that was a complete web of lies. He asked for prayers for our family, saying that his mother-in-law, Evelyn, had completely lost her grip on reality. He claimed that he and his friends had only come to check on me and care for me, but that I had chased them out into the street in the middle of the night and threatened them with a weapon. He wrote that wealth and isolation had driven me into a state of paranoid madness. I scrolled through the comments, and each one felt like a physical sting to my heart. People I had seen at the grocery store or at the local library were calling me a monster and a heartless old woman. Someone I had known back in Detroit commented that they always knew I was a bit cold and calculating, but never expected me to turn into a witch. They didn't know about the $300,000 Brian had drained from my accounts. They didn't know about the 6 years I had spent sacrificing my own happiness to keep him afloat. They only saw a grainy photo and a dramatic story, and they chose to believe the lies. I felt the world shrinking around me until I was just a tiny speck of dust in a vast and uncaring universe. The loneliness I felt in that moment was no longer a quiet choice I had made for my own peace. It felt like a life sentence. Just as I was about to turn off the phone and give in to the tears that were stinging my eyes, a soft and steady knock sounded at my door. It was not the aggressive pounding of Brian or the heavy thud of a stranger. It was a rhythmic and familiar sound that I recognized from years of Sunday brunches and holiday gatherings. I looked at the security monitor and saw Howard standing there. Howard had been my late husband's closest friend and his personal attorney for decades. He was a man of quiet dignity and immense integrity. In his hands, he held a brown paper bag with 2 Starbucks cups and a box of warm croissants, the kind of comfort food he knew I always reached for when the world became too much to handle. I opened the door, and before I could even find the words to explain what had happened, Howard looked at me with an expression of such deep empathy that my heart nearly stopped. He didn't ask me to explain or demand to hear my side of the story. He simply held up the coffee and said that he had seen the post online, and that was exactly why he was here. He told me clearly and firmly that he knew I would never do the things they were saying, and that he was here to stand by me. That one simple sentence caused the heavy armor I had been wearing all night to finally melt away. I started to cry, not out of the pain of the betrayal, but out of the sheer relief of being seen and believed by someone who truly knew my heart. For the first time that night, I felt like I was no longer fighting this battle in total isolation. We sat down at the kitchen island together, and the warmth of the coffee cup in my hands seemed to seep all the way into my spirit. Howard took out his reading glasses and began to look over the bank statements and the digital logs I had compiled. He moved with a calm and methodical precision that reminded me of my own engineering days. He told me I had done an incredible job of gathering the data, and that my professional mind had likely saved my future. He began to explain that what Brian was doing had a name in the legal world, and it was called elder financial exploitation. He talked about how we would use the truth to dismantle the lies Brian had built. Howard did not speak of getting even or seeking a cold victory. Instead, he spoke about restoring the truth and reclaiming my dignity. He reminded me of who I really was, a woman who had built a career and a life with her own 2 hands, and a mother who had loved her daughter with every fiber of her being. His presence and his deep understanding of our shared values helped me find the confidence that Brian had tried so hard to steal. I realized that I didn't need to shout at the crowds of strangers on the internet or defend myself to people who didn't matter. I only needed to stand firm in the reality of the facts and let the law do its work. When Howard finally left later that night, the darkness outside no longer felt like a threat. I knew I had a sharp and loyal ally by my side, and most importantly, I had finally found my way back to myself. Watching Evelyn's journey makes me wonder, who stood by you when the world turned away? We all need a Howard to remind us of our inner strength. Who was the person for you? Please share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear about the friends who helped you find your light again. Howard set his reading glasses down on the table as the steam from the Starbucks coffee, which had gone cold a long time ago, finally stopped rising. The large oak dining table was no longer a place for quiet afternoon tea or vases of fresh flowers. Instead, it was buried under mountains of crumpled invoices, Wells Fargo bank statements, and colorful sticky notes that marked every suspicious transaction. Looking at Howard across the table, I could almost see the shadow of my late husband. He used to sit in that exact spot every weekend, meticulously calculating our family budget with a pencil and a legal pad. But tonight, we were not planning for a bright future or a family vacation. We were performing a forensic autopsy on a decade of deception, searching for the jagged fragments of a betrayal that had been hidden in plain sight. Evelyn Howard said, his voice dropping into a low tone filled with professional concern. We need to look much deeper into what Brian called his educational expenses. This data simply does not match the reality of a student pursuing an MBA in Florida. I opened my laptop and felt the familiar glow of the screen against my tired eyes as I launched Microsoft Excel. My fingers began to move across the keys with a rhythmic precision, a habit that had sustained me through 40 years of mechanical engineering in the heart of Detroit. I began to categorize the $300,000 that had vanished over the last 6 years into specific project codes, just as I used to do for multi-million-dollar engine designs. Project 1 was the MBA tuition. Project 2 was the repairs on Emily's old house. Project 3 was the emergency medical bills. As the rows and columns began to align, a horrifying picture started to emerge with cold, technical clarity. An engineer knows that if the input does not equal the output, there is a massive leak in the system. And the leak in my life was the man I had considered my own son. I stopped at a specific wire transfer of $50,000 from the autumn of 3 years ago. At the time, Brian told me he needed to pay his final semester tuition and his thesis fees at the University of Miami. I looked closely at the digital transaction code on the electronic statement. It was not sent to an educational institution or a registrar's office. I performed a quick search of the bank identifier code online and felt my heart being squeezed by an invisible hand. That money had been transferred directly to a high-end luxury car dealership in Fort Lauderdale. On that exact same week, Brian had posted a photo on his private Facebook page of a deep blue BMW convertible, which I had foolishly assumed belonged to one of his wealthy friends. He had used the money meant for my late daughter's legacy to buy a toy for his own vanity. The disgust I felt was a physical weight in my stomach, making it hard to breathe. Howard pointed to another line item of $30,000, labeled as waterproofing and roof repairs for Emily's old house, where Brian was still living. "Look at this, Evelyn," he said. "The invoice looks professional enough, but look at the name of the contractor." I narrowed my eyes to read the fine print. The company was listed as Miller and Associates. I immediately searched the Florida Department of State business records. The company had been incorporated only 2 weeks before the money was transferred, and the registered agent was none other than Jessica herself. They had created a ghost company to siphon money out of my pocket under the guise of home maintenance. They never repaired a single shingle or sealed a single leak. They were simply laundering my kindness into their personal accounts to fund their lifestyle in Miami. The realization that they had planned this so carefully made me grip the edge of the table to keep from falling over. The most painful discovery was not the loss of the money itself, but the way they weaponized Emily's name to do it. There was a series of charges totaling $10,000, which Brian had noted as grave maintenance and annual memorial flowers. I looked at the secondary credit card statements I had given him, specifically to handle the expenses related to Emily's final resting place. The actual transactions appeared in a cold list of high-end retailers and restaurants: Victoria's Secret, 5-star steakhouses in South Beach, and luxury jewelry boutiques. He had used the grief of a mourning mother to pay for lingerie and expensive gifts for his new wife. Every bouquet of lilies he told me he had placed on Emily's grave was actually a round of expensive cocktails in Jessica's hand at a rooftop bar. I felt like a fool, a woman who had spent years feeding parasites with the very lifeblood of her family. Howard was silent for a long time after we finished adding up the final column of numbers. The grand total was $298,450.20. That was the price of my blind generosity. That number represented 10 years of my hardest labor and the retirement fund that was supposed to provide me with a world of travel or a scholarship fund in Emily's name. Now it was just a sea of red digits on a computer screen. This revelation was like a high-voltage electric shock, clearing away the last of the fog in my mind. I no longer felt a single ounce of regret for kicking them out of my house. I only felt a deep and burning regret that I had not looked at these numbers years ago when the first signs of the malfunction appeared. I shut down the laptop, and the room returned to a heavy silence. But this time, it was a silence filled with power. I looked at Howard, and my eyes were no longer wet with tears. They held the cold, sharp focus of an engineer who was preparing to dismantle a failing structure, piece by piece. "Howard," I said, my voice so calm it even surprised me. "We are not just going to get the money back. We are going to reclaim the truth. I want Brian and Jessica to face every single one of these numbers in a court of law. I have spent 6 years listening to their lies, and now it is time for them to hear what the data has to say." Howard gave me a small, supportive smile. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in years, because I knew the illusion was finally dead, and from its ashes, a new Evelyn Clark had finally woken up. After Howard left, carrying the thick files of Brian's financial schemes, I did not turn on the lights. I sat there in the darkness of my study, letting the raw truth of everything we had discovered sink deep into my bones. The sharp disgust I felt earlier was slowly being replaced by a vast and hollow emptiness. I eventually stood up, and my tired legs carried me toward the master bedroom, the very room that only a few hours ago had been choking with the heavy and cheap scent of Jessica's perfume. I threw open the double balcony doors and let the cool, salt breeze from the Gulf of Mexico rush in to scrub the air and wash away the remnants of their presence. I needed a clean breath, and I needed to talk to Emily. I needed to find her again, not through the twisted web of Brian's lies, but through the honesty of my own heart. I walked over to the bookshelf, where I kept a small cedar wood box. It is a simple thing, but I have carried it with me from my old life in Detroit all the way to this new house in Florida. It contains no money and no technical drawings. With trembling hands, I pulled out a mustard yellow knitted shawl. I had made this for Emily during her very last winter. The wool has frayed and thinned over the years, but when I pressed it against my face, I could still catch a faint lingering scent of lavender, the fragrance she loved so much. I closed my eyes, and for a brief moment I saw her sitting right there in the velvet armchair by the window. She was laughing at a book in her hand, and the light was hitting her hair just right. "Mom, look," she seemed to say. "The sunset is so beautiful." Her laugh in my mind was as clear as crystal, and it was so different from the manipulative tone Brian had used to chain me to my own guilt for 6 long years. I had spent so much time punishing myself, thinking that by supporting Brian, I was somehow keeping Emily's spirit at rest. I let my regret for not being able to save her turn me into a willing victim for a parasite. But touching this shawl, I finally realized how wrong I was. My Emily was a strong and upright girl, whom I raised with all the pride of an engineer. She would never want her mother to be pushed aside and treated like a servant. She would never want her name to be used as a cruel excuse for someone to rob and insult her mother. "I am so sorry, Emily," I whispered into the evening wind. "I let the pain blind me for too long. I let my regret steal the time I should have spent being happy for both of us." A strange warmth wrapped around my shoulders in that moment, as if Emily were standing right there, telling me it was finally going to be okay. The sadness was still there, but it was no longer a heavy weight that crushed my spirit. Instead, it was a flame that fueled my will. I realized that standing up and exposing Brian was not just an act of revenge. It was an act of protecting the purity of the name Emily Clark. I will not let him use the memory of my daughter as a tool for fraud for another second. I folded the shawl neatly and placed it back into the box. Then I wiped away my very last tear. The moonlight was now shining bright across the ocean waves, and I knew that when the sun rose tomorrow, I would enter the final confrontation with a completely different spirit. I am no longer a weak or grieving widow. I am a mother fighting for her child's honor. The early Florida sunrise usually brings a sense of renewed hope, but this morning, it only served to highlight the ugly black tire marks scorched onto my paved driveway, the remaining traces of the eviction from the night before. I took a slow sip of my bitter black coffee, trying to keep my hands from trembling, as I thought about the files Howard was currently finalizing for the court. That brief moment of quiet was suddenly ripped apart by the aggressive and persistent blaring of a car horn outside my iron gates. I looked at my security monitor and saw Brian's car. He was no longer with his loud group of friends. It was just him and Jessica. Seeing the sheer hostility on his face through the lens, I knew that this storm would never truly pass unless I stood my ground and faced it one last time. I set my coffee cup down, smoothed the collar of my shirt, and walked out into the heat of the morning. I stood a safe distance back from the iron gates, feeling the sweltering heat radiating off the asphalt and the even greater heat of Brian's rage. He was no longer pretending to cry like he had the previous night. Instead, he was screaming, his voice raspy and jagged with anger. He yelled at me, asking if I had any idea what I had done. He claimed Jessica was having a psychological breakdown because of the rough way the police had handled them. He accused me of destroying his reputation in the neighborhood and threatened to sue me for defamation and causing severe emotional distress. Jessica stood right beside him, holding her phone up to record the entire scene, her face a mask of cold defiance. She told me they had already contacted a high-priced lawyer and asked if I thought my money gave me the right to treat family like trash. She screamed that I would pay for every single cent I had. They were clearly trying to manufacture a scene, a narrative where I was the wealthy and cruel villain. The feeling of my personal space and my honor being violated made my chest tighten, and I felt a bitter surge of indignation rising in my throat. When I remained silent, Brian shifted his tactics. He lowered his voice to that quiet, threatening tone he used to use to manipulate Emily years ago. He told me to think very carefully about what I was doing. He warned me that if this ever went to a courtroom, my name and Emily's name would be dragged through the mud for the whole world to see. He asked if I really wanted everyone to know that my only daughter had married a man I was now calling a criminal. He asked if I wanted to see this family destroyed forever. Then came the real hook. He told me that if I would just withdraw the police report and sign over 50% of the villa to him, he would let everything go. He called it my last chance to avoid dying all alone in this house. He was weaponizing my own loneliness against me, betting that at my age, the fear of isolation would be much stronger than my self-respect. For a split second, a wave of helplessness washed over me as I looked at him and wondered how my daughter could have ever loved a man with such a hollow soul. But then I remembered the feel of Emily's mustard yellow shawl against my face. I remembered the exact figure of $298,450.20. That helplessness transformed into a cold, sharp surge of strength. I stepped a little closer to the gate and looked Brian directly in the eyes. I asked him if he was finally finished talking. I held up my iPad, and opened the document Howard had sent over to me at 6 o'clock that morning. I told him that I was holding a formal cease and desist order from Howard's law firm. I told him that if he wanted to talk about lawsuits, we could certainly do that, because we had already completed the civil filing for elder financial exploitation against him. I told him I had every bit of evidence regarding the fake invoices from Miller and Associates he used to drain my accounts. I looked over at Jessica and told her she was also named as a co-conspirator in those files. Her face went completely pale in an instant. Brian tried to interrupt me, but I did not give him a single second to speak. I told him his entire system had collapsed, and I was no longer his sponsor. I reminded him that I was an engineer, and I had just performed a total dismantle of every lie he had ever told me. I informed him that every threatening message he had sent me this morning had been recorded and forwarded directly to the Collier County Sheriff's Office. I gave him exactly 60 seconds to get away from my gate, or the arrest warrants would be executed immediately for violating the temporary restraining order Howard was currently processing. Brian stood there completely stunned, his mouth hanging open, but no words coming out. He looked at me, and for the very first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He realized the woman standing in front of him was no longer a grieving widow who could be controlled by crocodile tears. Jessica quickly grabbed his arm, her voice shaking, as she told him they had to leave because I had gone crazy. He turned the car around, and the tires screeched against the pavement in a desperate and bitter retreat. But this time, I felt no pain in my heart. I stood there and watched the car disappear at the end of the road, feeling a sense of absolute and total freedom. I had protected myself, and I had protected my life, and most importantly, I had protected Emily from their greed. I was not alone at all. I had Howard, I had the truth, and I had myself. I walked back into my house to prepare for our final day in court with the most peaceful smile I had worn in 6 long years. Friends, emotional blackmail is a heavy burden used to control us. Have you ever felt pressured to do something you knew was wrong? Did you stay silent or find the strength to set boundaries like Evelyn? Please share your story below so we can support each other. The roar of Brian's engine slowly faded away down Seabreeze Avenue, leaving behind a silence so deep I could finally hear the gentle rhythm of the waves in the distance. I stood there on my porch, my hands still trembling slightly, but my heart had found a steady and certain beat. For the first time in 6 long years, I did not feel like a widow, hiding in the shadows of my own regret. I took a deep breath, feeling the clean salt air fill my lungs, and I stepped back into the house. I knew that Brian's retreat was only the end of a chaotic chapter, and that tomorrow, a much more challenging journey in a courtroom would begin. I realized I no longer had time for fear, because the truth was waiting for me to become its voice. Later that afternoon, Howard arrived at my house, carrying a worn leather briefcase that seemed to hold the literal weight of justice. We did not sit at the kitchen table this time. Instead, we moved into my main study, where my old mechanical blueprints from Detroit still hung on the walls. Howard spread out the bank statements we had marked in bright yellow, the screenshots of Brian's cruel social media posts, and the hard evidence of Jessica's shell company. "Evelyn," he said, in his steady and calming voice, "American law is very strict regarding elder financial exploitation, especially when it involves the falsification of documents. We do not need to argue about morality with him in front of a judge. We only need to let these cold numbers speak for themselves." I nodded, my fingers tracing the edges of the neatly stacked files. As an engineer, I understood that a system is only as strong as its verified links. I was finally ready to present those links to the world. Howard looked at me with deep concern in his eyes and asked if I was worried about what the neighbors and the people online were saying. I was silent for a long moment. Those hateful words on Facebook were still out there, and the wound of being called a heartless mother had not completely closed yet. But then I thought about Emily's eyes in the photograph on the shelf. Howard, I have spent my entire life building structures meant to survive the most violent storms. My honor and my reputation were not built on social media likes or the bitter comments of people who do not even know who I am. My character was built on honesty. If I remain silent now, I am not just betraying myself. I am betraying the legacy of my daughter. Howard gave me a small smile and a firm nod, letting me know that I had finally crossed the last psychological barrier. On the evening before the hearing, I spent my time carefully choosing what to wear. I did not choose the dark and heavy black clothes of a grieving widow. Instead, I chose an elegant navy blue suit, the very one I wore when I presented the largest project of my career back in Detroit. It was the outfit of a woman who was in full command of her life. I meticulously ironed every single crease in the fabric, as if I were smoothing out the broken pieces of my own soul. I looked at myself in the mirror and stared deep into my own eyes, which had seen too much loss, but were now burning with a steady flame of determination. I no longer saw an old woman suffering from the cruelty of others. I saw Evelyn Clark, a woman of substance, preparing to step into the light to reclaim what belonged to her, her self-respect, and the absolute truth. I turned off the lights and lay down in my bed, and for the first time in many years, I did not reach for my sleeping pills. I knew that tomorrow would not be easy. I knew Brian would try every dirty trick to insult me in front of the judge, and Jessica would continue to play her role as a victim. But I had Howard by my side, and more importantly, I had a system of evidence that could not be denied. 6 years of regret were more than enough. The time I have left belongs to the truth. In the quiet moments before I fell asleep, I saw myself standing on a bridge I had designed myself, a structure that was strong and reached all the way to the horizon. I was ready to walk across that bridge, to leave the lies behind, and to enter a new chapter of my life, one where I am the one writing the script for my own future. The air in Naples this morning was no longer heavy and humid, like the days when Brian first descended upon my home. A light rain had fallen just before dawn, washing the pavement clean and leaving behind the fresh scent of damp earth and a cool breeze that felt like a long-awaited apology from the sky. I stepped into the Collier County Courthouse, wearing my navy blue suit, perfectly pressed and sharp, feeling the physical weight of the files Howard carried beside me. For 6 long years, I had lived in a private courtroom within my own mind, a place where I was both the defendant and the judge, constantly sentencing myself to guilt over Emily's passing. But today, I walk through these halls with a different posture. I did not come here to hide, and I did not come here looking for pity. I came to reclaim the truth that those silent numbers had been protecting for me all this time. Courtroom number 4 was so quiet that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the large clock hanging on the high wall. Brian and Jessica were already seated at the opposite table. Brian was still trying to maintain his polished appearance, wearing a silk tie that I would bet was bought with the very money he took from my account. He refused to look at me, only whispering occasionally to Jessica, who was doing her best to look like a victim, with her eyes heavily made up to appear as if she had been crying for days. When Judge Miller, a woman with sharp, observant eyes and a natural air of authority, entered the room, my heart gave a single heavy thud. This was no longer a desperate argument at my front gate. This was the place where every lie would finally have to face the hard steel of evidence. Brian was the first to speak. He stood up, and his voice was thick with emotion, like a practiced actor on a stage. He told the court that he had lost his wife and that he truly considered me to be his own mother. He claimed that every dollar I had given him was accepted as a gesture of family support to help him through his grief and care for his future. He said he never imagined I would use those gifts of love to accuse him of a crime simply because I was feeling lonely and angry in my old age. He even pulled out a small stack of photos of Emily, intentionally letting one fall to the floor to draw the attention of the room. I could hear a few people in the gallery whispering, and their looks of doubt reminded me of the cruel comments I had seen online. He was trying to turn a systematic case of financial abuse into a simple misunderstanding of family affection. Then it was Howard's turn. He did not start with loud or aggressive words. Instead, he calmly requested the court clerk to project the data analysis I had spent hours preparing onto the large screen. He told the court to set aside personal feelings for a moment and look at the cold reality of the numbers. He explained the flow of money from my accounts over the last 6 years, using the bright red bar charts I had designed. He pointed out the $50,000 Brian claimed was for MBA tuition, which was actually transferred directly to a BMW dealership on the very same day. He showed how the $30,000 for house repairs actually flowed into an account belonging to a company registered in Jessica's name. Howard told the judge this was not a gift, and it was not a misunderstanding. It was a carefully calculated scheme to drain the assets of a grieving widow. I saw the first beads of sweat break out on Brian's forehead. Jessica began to fidget nervously with her designer handbag, a bag that probably cost more than my entire year's worth of health insurance. Howard then played the recording of the call from the morning before, where Brian had openly threatened to ruin Emily's name if I did not sign over half of my home to him. His aggressive and shameless voice filled the courtroom, completely shattering the image of the loyal son-in-law he had tried so hard to build. Judge Miller narrowed her eyes and looked at Brian with a coldness that made him look down at his hands. The truth, when it is presented with logic and transparency, has a terrifying power to dismantle those who live behind a mask of pretense. The judge eventually allowed me to speak. I stood up and rested my hands on the oak table, feeling an incredible sense of calm. I told the court that I am an engineer, and I spent my entire life learning how to fix broken systems. I admitted that I made a terrible mistake in believing I could use money to fix a heart that had been rotted by greed. I said, but in the last 6 years, I had lost much more than $300,000. I had lost my peace and my belief in the bond of family. I told the judge I was not standing there to seek punishment for Brian, but to finally liberate myself from the weight of my own regret. I wanted to state for the record that the kindness of a mother is never a license for abuse. After the longest 15 minutes of my life, Judge Miller returned to the bench. She stated that the evidence of elder financial exploitation and the falsification of documents by Brian Miller was absolute and undeniable. She ordered that Brian must repay the full amount of $298,450 to me within the next 12 months. She also issued a permanent restraining order, stating that Brian and Jessica were never to approach me or my home again. Regarding the defamation online, she ordered Brian to post a formal public apology on every social media platform he had used to attack me. The sound of the judge's gavel hitting the wood sounded like a bell of freedom ringing through my soul. I saw Brian collapse into his chair, his face pale, as he realized the luxury life he built on exploitation was officially over. Jessica hurried out of the room to avoid the cameras of a few local reporters. I walked out of the courthouse, and the Florida sun was now bright and soaring in the sky. Howard walked beside me and placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. I looked up at the vast blue horizon and felt a lightness I had never known before. The money might take time to recover, but that did not matter as much as the fact that I had recovered my honor and the honor of my daughter. I was no longer a victim of my past. I am Evelyn Clark, and from this day forward, my life is a new design, one that is strong, independent, and filled with light. Autumn in Florida does not have the fiery red leaves of Michigan, but the sky is an impossibly clear blue today. I am sitting on my porch, enjoying a slice of key lime pie that Howard just brought over, and the sharp scent of fresh lime feels so clean and refreshing. My life is now measured in these quiet golden moments, rather than by the size of bank checks or the heavy weight of someone else's lies. Brian has finally disappeared from my world, taking the wreckage of his greed with him. 6 long years of regret have finally faded into the background, replaced by a new system, a system built on self-respect and the strength of a family I have chosen for myself. I look at the photograph of Emily on the side table, and for the first time, she seems to be truly smiling back at me, as peaceful as my own soul feels right now. My dear friends, the story of Evelyn Clark ends here, but her new journey, the journey of a woman who is the absolute master of her own time and emotions, is only just beginning. Standing here as your storyteller, I feel an immense sense of admiration for the engineer's mind inside her. She did not use hatred or bitterness to fight back. Instead, she used the cold clarity of truth and logic to rescue herself from the darkness. Perhaps the greatest lesson Evelyn has left for us is this: time is the only resource we can never recreate or buy back. We can lose money, and we can certainly lose toxic relationships, but we must never allow our precious final years to be stolen by those who do not cherish us, even if they are our own flesh and blood. Family is not always defined by a shared last name. It is found in empathy and the deep respect of each other's boundaries. Do not let the shadows of your past or the fear of being alone turn you into an involuntary sponsor for someone else's selfishness. Be as brave as Evelyn. Reset the system of your life and only allow what is truly worthy to enter your sanctuary. Has this story touched a hidden corner of your heart? Which part of Evelyn's journey stayed with you the most? And more importantly, what is the lesson you are taking away for your own path after hearing her story today? Please leave a comment and share your thoughts with us below. I'm Casey, and I would be so honored to walk beside you in our next conversation. Thank you for listening.